So I started 2 weeks ago, and I didn't know I started. I thought I'd finish also, but touched on Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2. And we're going to, basically I got through one verse and have another verse. Seems like there's always another verse too. True. How things fit together. And in that fitting together, things become somewhat clear. So, before I get there though, like I say, there's always another verse, right? You know, we were talking about victory. And basically, what I was kind of taught as I grew up, or maybe the assumption I made, was that victory was a life that looked the way I wanted it to. You know, a Christian life that kind of looked the way that I desired, which was a sense of relief, circumstances that, though out of my control, were in God's control. Usually an outcome that I could understand as being God's will. So victory and overcoming kind of went hand in hand. And as I've gotten older and had more experiences, I've found that not only do I need to redefine that, but God's redefining that in my life also as to what He sees as true victory for me in my life, in my relationship with Him. So, coming out of the ministry, I've told some of y'all that I have conversations with that I used to run in circles not only with pastors from the church that I was at, but other pastors also. And it seemed like whenever we faced these circumstances and we're looking for victory, and it looked like victory might have been not only on the horizon, but over the horizon somewhere, out of sight. You didn't want to be the person that said, well, I guess we're going to have to trust God in this. Because the response usually was, oh, has it really come to that? You know? And some guys kind of looked like every once in a while, some guys I'd say, well, you know, we're just going to have to trust God. And some guys looked like I pulled a switchblade on them, you know, they were just aghast. And that may be overstating it, but there's kind of this, oh no. I mean, really, is it to that point? Don't we have some options? Can't we think of a mitigating set of actions whereby we can trust God to bless those instead of just being totally flat and hopeless, helpless? And I want to tell you, helpless isn't hopeless. So I want to look at a couple of verses before we get to the text. Can I get somebody to do a favor? Who has a watch or a phone? Can you do this for me, Tracy? Can you kind of give me a high sign when we get to maybe 10 till?
Yeah.
And then I won't have to watch the clock.
Yeah, you're free.
And I hope that doesn't distract you also.
No, that's what I do.
Okay, thank you. So your high sign may be having to throw something at me to get my attention. So John 6:28. You don't necessarily have to turn there. It might do you well to read it or mark it. But I hadn't seen this verse. It's strange that, you know, my Christian life started 58 years ago, and I hadn't seen this verse. So this is right after, you know, feeding of using the, you know, Jesus multiplies fishes. So a group of people come to him, and they said unto him, what shall we do that we might work the works of God? That's kind of what we see as victory in our lives. We're working the works of God. It doesn't have to be miraculous. I mean, not that kind of work. It just has to have a sense of miraculous in our lives. That something occurred that we cannot point to in ourselves or external from ourselves where we say, hey, this was God's hand in our life. So they come and they say, what should we do to work the works of God? And Jesus answers interestingly, and he said unto them, this is the work of God, that ye believe on whom he hath sent. So they're saying, what can we do? What things can we do? And Jesus says, this is the work of God, encapsulates all those works. Works fall under work. And he says, believe on whom he hath sent. And that word believe is an interesting word. It's kind of, notice that it says, believe on him. It doesn't say believe in him. And there's an interesting syntax in the Greek that implies that this believing on is different than believing in. Remember that folks said, hey, we believe in you. We believe in God. And the answer came and said, well, you do well, because the demons do it also and they fear. So there's a difference in believing in and believing on. And this believing on implies in the Greek a believing into and unto. So there's this believing into the Son of God and unto the Son of God. And the unto implies a union that occurs as we believe. So I can believe in something without ever believing to the point where a union occurs. I can believe that I can, watching the camera because I walk out a lot, I believe that I can stand here. Some of you can't see it, but I've got maybe 4 inches of my boot hanging off. I believe I can stand here and maintain my balance. I believe in that. Now, the issue becomes, do I believe enough that I have such a union with that I can do the same thing over a 1,000-foot precipice? Then I'm believing into and unto my ability to do this. And this is simple standing here. But I can tell you it's not simple at 1,000 feet. It's probably not simple for me at 10 feet. So when I was younger, just as an example as to why I say that, when I was younger I used to do a little rock climbing. There's a place in the Tacoma where the rock is maybe 20 feet tall. And I got about 10 feet up it, and I couldn't figure out how to make that next move. And I had made some moves that I had extended myself on. You know, I had to kind of jump to the next one, and I was wondering how I was going to jump backwards to the last one. And as I sat there and contemplated that, I knew my ability, I believed that I could fall off of this thing and not hurt myself. But you know what this leg started telling me? It's called a sewing machine leg. And I knew I did not believe into and in union with the fact that I was safe. So I know how 1,000 feet's gonna, I'm not even gonna get out here at 1,000 feet. But there is a sense that we can believe in something without believing on it. And Jesus' answer is, believe on him. So we believe in such a way that we become dependent and in union with. We place our confidence in. So Jesus said, I want you to believe in a way, to do the work of God comes out of believing in a way where not only do you believe in, but you have it drives you into and unto a confident, secure relationship with God. So, I believe that's foundational for this, what God would define as a victorious life. I can believe for me, or I can believe such that there's a union that occurs, a manifestation of my confidence in God, His love, His concern, His compassion, His care, His provision. So what keeps me from that? I can tell you what keeps me from that. It's kind of interesting. Paul writing to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians, we're going to go to 5. There's an interesting dynamic that's happening at that church. This false apostle has risen and is belittling, besmirching, undermining, attempting to Paul's apostleship and his authority. So Paul, in his answer, does an interesting thing. It appears that in places this guy says, well, you know, he acts really big when he's away, but he really doesn't have any authority because when he comes here, he's meek and mild. And he undercuts who Paul is and compares Paul to who he is in this false apostleship where he points out his own superiority. And he says, hey, compare. There's a comparison here. Let's enter into a competition. I'll compare me with him, you compare me with him. Let's see how this works. So Paul, in 2 Corinthians 10, has an interesting parenthetical as to what spiritual warfare really is. Because what he says is, I have a spiritual authority. And here's how spiritual warfare occurs in spiritual authority. Here's the basis of my spiritual authority. There's no boasting here. But here's how I war. It says the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So he says, hey, I don't war on this plane. But here's how I war in my life. I believe that's what he's saying because he makes it personal. He's no longer making it about this competition that the other false apostle wants to make it. It's not about being him, he says. And I believe this is another dynamic in victorious living. It's not about me and him. It's not about me and you. When I have conflict, it's not about me and the circumstances. When I have conflict with people, it's not about my conflict with them. And Paul points to it here. He says there is a conflict that's occurring. But in this conflict, it's about me and God. Because he says he, look at verse 5, he personalizes it. He says, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Can I bring your thoughts into captivity to the obedience of Christ? I can't. I can't do that. So Paul says this spiritual warfare that I'm entering into, even in this place, in this circumstance, and for you, and in my ministry, and in my interrelationship with other people and with God, is based on my thought life and becomes a circumstance and situation that I need to understand is my relationship with God. Not my relationship with a false apostle, even my relationship with y'all whom you should know by my ministry, I have your best at heart. So there are a lot of things that he could have taken umbrage at that he didn't, because he said, this is not about me and this apostle. This is not about me and you. This is not about me and this circumstance. It's about me and God. So he says these weapons are powerful. It's a word that we get dynamite from. It means it's capable, like dynamite is capable. Interesting words. He again, when he starts to point it inside, he says, we're casting down imaginations. These are reckonings. These are speculations. Everything that exalts is kind of a prideful exaltation, like building a large, if you're a great, powerful warrior, you build a big fortress. You want, when it's seen, you want your power to be shown. So it's this prideful exaltation that points back to self. Exalts itself against the knowledge of God. Bringing into captivity is like leading away slaves. After a battle, they used to take the slaves, lead them back into the town in procession. They brought them into captivity and subjection. Every thought to the obedience of Christ. Interesting word, obedience. Kind of harkens back to where we were 2 weeks ago in verse 1, talking about the submission, which is a being subject to, being yielded to, standing by, awaiting that relationship. Obedience means an attentive hearkening. Again, an internal work, not an external work. We have to bring these things into the obedience of Christ. An inward hearkening to. So I've got things in my head. I believe that what Paul was saying is, I recognize this circumstance and situation, and I could have things in my head that would not make this better. In fact, would complicate it, because if I really just want to get down and do resumes and fight power and fight external activity, then some people aren't going to get it. But if I set myself in such a place where I continue to hearken to God in my thought life, and as I see things raising themselves up against that knowledge of God, and I recognize them for what they are, and I go back to a yielded subjection and submission in my life, an attentive hearkening, no longer looking at the circumstances or looking at the person or looking at possible outcomes, as I begin to hearken back to this obedience to Christ, as I begin to see that the work that needs to be done is to believe on Him, then I'm closer to victory. And I'm closer to seeing Him in my life and seeing His hand in my life. And I'm closer to benefiting in my walk because I'm being drawn into an intimacy with Him rather than being drawn into an outward battle. So again, we've seen this diagram. What are the chances of me picking one that writes? And we've said over and over again that this is the dynamic where I grow my relationship with God and my relationship with others, and my conflict with others should be driving me back to an attentive hearkening. A question as to what in my head is exalting itself against the knowledge of God, because you know what? God's working these things for my good. I believe that Paul could say, this guy raises up for my good and the good of the gospel. I could take the position that says, no, this is bad, and I need to do something about it. Paul could have said, I'm going to come down there and we'll have some warfare, and let's see who wins. So the word obedience, this attentive hearkening rather than a doing, because I can do without ever even consulting God. And I can do being driven by something in my head that's exalting itself against the knowledge of God. This attentive hearkening, this obedience, this working the work of God through this believing, which is a dependent position, is interesting because the question becomes, oh, is that all there is? I mean, do we just sit around? Do we just hearken to God? Do we just, right? Do we sit? And again, I tried to point out that this is a dynamic yielding. And I think the dog showed it really well on the video. That this dog is attentively hearkening. And I pointed out that the word that is translating submit in verse 1 of Romans 12 is also translated other places, same word, is yield. So it's this standing by that's yielded. Not a standing by that's inattentive, not a standing by that's lax, but it's a yielded standing by. It's an attentive standing by. And I quoted a verse in Romans 6:16 where the word submit is translated yield. But in 6:15 it says, what then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law but under grace? God forbid. So here's this concept of, okay, so we're under grace, so that means we can just kind of sit back? We can wait? We don't have any responsibility? Oh, that's a good word, isn't it? Because when I say responsibility, everybody hears it differently. Do we not have a role? Are we the active agent or not? Okay? So this submitted yielding to me implies I'm not the active agent any more than I was the active agent in my salvation. That the same activity that I am given is the same activity by which I receive salvation. A complete and utter dependence. An active hearkening to God and to His work in my life. So, again, I think this puts these two verses in Romans, because he begins with saying, so here's grace, does that just give us, do we just sit around, or do we just go ahead and sin? And so that grace might abound. He says, God forbid. He goes on in 16, know ye not that to whom you yield, submit, stand by, actively yielded. Know ye not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to obey, obey. It's that same word that we've been talking about. An attentive hearkening to. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, the servants ye are, to whom ye obey, same word, whether of sin unto death or obedience unto righteousness. So listen to it this way. Same word throughout. Same meaning throughout. Know ye not that to whom you yield yourselves servants to actively hearken to, his servants are ye to whom you actively hearken to, whether of sin unto death or actively hearkening to righteousness. So are you with me there? Obedience is an active hearkening to God. It's a yielding to, a subjection to, a submission to, a standing by, a servanthood that does not decide, hey, I'm going to go build a house for you. This servant is standing by the master. Just like the dog doesn't go, hey, last week you thought it was cool when I brought you a bone. So I'm going to bring you a bone today. And the master says, no, I want you sitting there. Just sit there. That's what I want from you today. Sit there. Actively hearken to me. This is the work of God. This is how you work the work of God. Actively hearken to me. You know what that is? You know what he's calling us to? Relationship. Intimacy. Not activity. Intimacy. Now you go, okay, so now you just said there's no activity. I'm sorry, if you're intimate with someone, if you have an intimate relationship with someone that's yielded and subject to and standing by, then your heart desire is to fill that need. So what do? Hey, I'm to the text. It was all preliminary. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Back to the mind. Paul says weapons of our warfare are not carnal, they're spiritual. Strongholds, bringing every thought captive into the obedience of Christ. Renew your mind. That you may prove what is that good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. So the word conformed is the word from which we have derived our word schematic. A blueprint. A plan. So don't be conformed, don't be blueprinted, don't be planned, don't act according to the schematic of this age. And I'll read you age. This is Trench's synonym of the New Testament. Age is better understood as all that floating mass of thoughts, opinions, maxims, speculations, that's also another translation for the word imagination, hopes, impulses, aims, aspirations at any time in the world. It constitutes a most real and effective power, being the moral or immoral atmosphere of the time. And it lends itself as a subtle informing spirit of the world of men. Informing, giving you insight, giving you advice. So he says all of these things, these thoughts, opinions, maxims, speculations, hopes, impulses, aims, aspirations that show you a blueprint, that give you a blueprint as to how to live. And he says, don't be formed, don't be conformed, don't let yourself be conformed to this pattern. Don't fashion your life according to this pattern. Now, step back and say, and ask, and let's all go, oh me. Because in reality, I find very little difference in what I call delightful than my neighbor. In reference to his hopes and dreams, his thoughts and opinions, his desires for his family and his children and his grandchildren. One of the things that we've always said is, I'm not saying it's right, but one of the things we've always said is, it's great to be in a Christian nation. What does that mean? Well, it means that, to me, my understanding of that, is that I'm saying that these thoughts, opinions, maxims, speculations, hopes, impulses, aims, aspirations tend to line up with the Bible. They tend to be found acceptable in my view of Christianity. And they can be driven just as much by the flesh as what I would see as not being. Because the issue is not an agreed upon outcome, but rather the agency by which that outcome is brought to pass. And I believe that what's truly good and beneficial can only be brought to pass in my life or in the world by God. And anything else, though not utterly contemptible, is still counterfeit. Now, how do these, I'm going to hit this again, you guys are going to be able to repeat it with me, that may be a test, okay? How do these thoughts, opinions, maxims, speculations, hopes, impulses, aims, and aspirations come about? Y'all know. Genesis chapter 3. See, here becomes this need for, and I have it. And the reason I know it's a need is because I've been through it. Okay? I'm not saying you all need it. I'm saying we all need it. Okay? I need it in my life. The issue becomes these schema, these blueprints, these plans, these methods of attaining have been passed on to us by our teachers, our parents, our grandparents, loving individuals in our life that want the best for us. All of them are there in our lives and believe it's their responsibility to point us the right direction and begin to develop an understanding in our lives from this point on what's desirable and what's beneficial. And that's much better than the opposite, okay? But the problem becomes that these blueprints that really don't even need anything to do with God, you know, be nice, share, work hard, plan. My dad used to say, why didn't you think about that before you did it? So I can blame him for my planning plotting, you know. But boy, he said, look, if you thought about this, this would not have occurred. You need to think better about what you're doing. So what ends up happening is that this becomes my approach to living. This schema, this blueprint. What I find interesting, again, good and evil, the word good is translated in different places in the New Testament. Listen to these. Beautiful, best, bountiful, cheerful, at ease, favor, fine, good, goodness, pleasure, precious, prosperity, wealth, welfare. Who doesn't want that? But those are all how that good is defined, the same word, good and evil, knowledge of good and evil. Suddenly, I get to decide what is, sorry, I'm going to do it to you again, beautiful, best, bountiful, cheerful, at ease, favorable, fine, good, goodness, pleasurable, precious, prosperity, wealth, and welfare. I get to define that. You know how I get to define that? Subjectively by my experience. And also by the pattern of what I've been told as all of those things. You know how you get all these things, Greg? You think about it before you do it. You work hard. You be goal-driven. You be goal-centered. You go get it. Evil, to spoil by breaking, to be good for nothing. Also translated afflict, displeasure, do harm, hurt, punish, vex. Notice there's nothing really moral there that talks about the morally intrinsic evilness there. It's all about how it affects, right? It's all about how it impacts. And so, I get to decide what's delightful for me. I'm not even taught what that should be from a very early age. And on the other hand, I get to decide and am taught and can buy into what is now evil or undesirable for me. And the problem with schema and blueprints is that's where we get our definitions. And then we add to those by who we hang out with and who we come in contact with and who has input into our lives. And we may adjust those through our life experience. But we're always looking for something to replace it with that we still typify as desirable, and we still attempt to shun the undesirable in our life. And that's how we come by the schema. Usually there's always the one guy in the back with his hat turned backwards who says, well, so what's wrong with that? That's how I became who I am. I'm a good person. I try to do the right thing. I mean, what's wrong with the desirable running my life? What's wrong with me conforming to it? Well, it leaves God out of the program, to be honest with you. That's my experience. I don't need God to define what's desirable for me. I get to do it myself. And then when God comes in and says, you know what, afflictions are desirable for you, I go, no, Gary, how can you speak? There's no way this is right. And then when somebody in my life comes up, this person right here, comes up and they do something that I believe is undesirable because it vexes me, I'm at war with them. Or I believe it's my responsibility to do something about it. No, this cannot last. This cannot be. This thing is not going to work. And for everybody's good, principled person, get up as high as I could. On principle, I won't allow this to stand. Because it meets my criteria of undesirable, and therefore it's evil. And then I'm at war with them. Instead of Paul says, oh, you know, it's undesirable, Paul could have said, just by sheer principle, I need to go down there and alleviate the circumstance for God. And Paul said, what I need to do, I need to look internally do a self-check before God, do a relationship check before God. What's motivating this? My anger? My propensity to protect myself? My belief that God cannot work without me being there? My lack of, oh, now we're getting a little bit deeper. Wait just a second. This is gray. Self-disclosing here, not pointing a finger. My lack of faith in God, that God's in control of this and has a plan and a purpose that will glorify Him, and that what I need to do is hearken, that my work that needs to be done in this circumstance is to believe into and unto. Because then everything that raises its head in my life can suddenly become this. And it no longer becomes about this circumstance or my definitions or my understanding, but it becomes my relationship with God and my belief. And my belief in His goodness towards me, and my belief in His faithfulness to me. So, when I want to make things about somebody else, when I find myself going da-da-da-da-da, even in the midst of my doing that, there's this little voice that says, you know what, Greg, this is not about you and them, this is about you and me, God says. And God says, I believe, God brings me to a point where He says, you know, there may be some things in your head that we need to talk about. There may be some beliefs in your head. There may be some things that you've accepted in your head, and I need to talk to you about these things because they're not good for you. Because they rob you of the joy that I would have in your life. So, how do we become conformed? We begin to look externally or internally to what we find desirable, and we begin to live that way. And we begin to look internally as to what we find undesirable, and we begin to war with it. And that's the world's blueprint. At the bottom line, it's also Satan's initial interaction, or the serpent's initial, to be a little bit more specific. The serpent's initial interaction with man said, what did he say? You need to do this blank to be this blank. You need this to occur so that you can get this outcome. You want to be like God, eat of the tree. You want to be blessed by God, do these things. You want to be happy, these things need to occur. You understand how your peace, if you lose it, is based on a schema? I don't understand that deeply because I still experience it. But I realize that when I lose my peace, it's based on a schema. Because I believe X has to happen for me to have peace. And I believe X has to happen for me to love you. And I believe X has to happen for me to experience the fruit of the Spirit, not the fruit of circumstances or relationships. So, interestingly enough, some of these things are so ingrained in our person that they seem that they're usually beneath our awareness. I'm angry, I don't like. and they seem to be obedient, but they're still there for the Spirit of God to place His finger on if we're attentive. And if we see our position and activity as yielding and standing by as a servant, and that obedience, that true obedience, if it manifests itself in activity, is based on this attentive believing into and onto, where I can go and say, I'm totally and utterly incapable of doing this, but God is capable of doing this through me. So a couple of words. Be not conformed to the world, but be ye transformed. That's a metamorphosis. Word is the word we get metamorphosis from. There's a change that occurs. By the renewing of our mind, it's a renovation that occurs. It's not a remodel. We're not just slapping some paint. We're not trying to find a better desirable. We're not trying to find better definitions of what's good or what's evil. We're letting God decide all of those things in our life, and we're attentively hearkening to Him, and we come across a circumstance or a situation that we find untenable, and God draws us to Himself. Into deeper intimacy. So, let me end with, did I just give you a different schema? Did I just give you a different blueprint? Did I just give you different goods and evils, goods to embrace and evils to shun? I hope not. This word renew is only used 2 times in the New Testament. Once here. He doesn't say you renew your mind. Notice there's nothing here that says you renew your mind. It's by the renewing of your mind. And what's wonderful about that is there's no schema to be had and no activity to now fulfill, but it hearkens and points to, or maybe this verse points to this verse, but they meet in Titus 3:5. Not by works of righteousness which we've done, according to His mercy He saved us, by the washing of regeneration and the renewing of the Holy Spirit. So again, how does that occur? Well, believing into and onto. Want to do the works of God? Believe into and onto and one that is sin. Yield. Be attentive to Him. And He'll put His finger. Because He's drawing us into relationship and life and intimacy. Let's pray. Father, I thank You for the insight that You supply through Your Word and by Your Spirit. And I thank You for Your provision that we can believe into and unto, into union with. And I believe You for the relationship to which You call us. In Jesus' name.